You know what really gets under my skin? Liars. And I can spot them a mile away. After decades on the bench, I've seen every trick in the book. But this case, this one took the cake. A woman stood in my courtroom, looked me dead in the eye, and claimed her friend stole her car, disappeared for a year, vanished into thin air. There was just one tiny problem with her story. None of it was true, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. Let me take you back to one of those days where you walk into court thinking you've heard it all, and then life surprises you. Two women stood before me, former friends, now bitter enemies. One claimed theft, betrayal, and an elaborate disappearing act. The other, she just looked tired, like someone who'd been dragged through the mud for no good reason. I'm Judge Judy Shanglin, and I don't have time for nonsense. Never have, never will. The plaintiff was Ms. O'Brien, middle-aged, worked as a cleaning contractor, owned a couple of cars. She came into my courtroom with fire in her eyes and a story that would make your head spin. According to her, her so-called friend, Miss Mackenzie, had stolen her PT Cruiser while she was out of town, wrecked it completely, and then went into hiding for over a year to avoid facing the consequences. Sounds pretty serious, right? Grand theft auto, property damage, a year-long manhunt to find the culprit. Except when I start digging, and trust me, I always dig, the whole thing started falling apart faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. I started with Ms. Mackenzie, the defendant. Simple questions first. That's how you get to the truth, one brick at a time. Where do you live? I asked her. Tahakapi, Your Honor, she replied calmly. How long? 14 years. 14 years. Same house, same address. You'd think if someone was trying to hide from you, they wouldn't spend 14 years in the same place, right? But we'll get back to that little detail. Miss Mackenzie lived there with her two sons. She'd inherited the house from her father just that February, but she'd been living in it her whole time in Tahakapi. She wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't hiding. She was just living her life. Then I asked her about Ms. O'Brien. How long had they known each other? 5 or 6 years, she said. Were you friends? Not anymore. There it was. That bitterness you hear when friendships go south. I've seen it 1,000 times. Two people who used to trust each other, now tearing each other apart in my courtroom. Now here's where things got interesting. I turned to Ms. O'Brien, and I asked her the question that was burning in my mind. Why did you wait over a year to bring this case? See, the incident she was suing over happened in September 2013, but she didn't file her lawsuit until well into 2014. That's a long time to wait if someone supposedly stole your car and destroyed it. Most people would be banging down the courthouse doors within weeks, if not days. Ms. O'Brien had an answer ready. Oh boy, did she have an answer. She disappeared, Your Honor, she said with conviction. When she found out I was going to serve her with papers, she just vanished. I couldn't find her anywhere. It wasn't until June 2014, when she opened a new restaurant, that I was finally able to track her down and serve her. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I looked at Miss Mackenzie. You've been living in the same house for 14 years, correct? Yes, Your Honor. I turned back to Ms. O'Brien. So she didn't disappear at all, did she? She's been in the same place the whole time. The look on Ms. O'Brien's face, that's what we call the oh no moment. The moment when someone realizes their story just hit a brick wall. Well, she left the area, Ms. O'Brien stammered. She was living at a pizza place in Courtroom. Stop, I said. Just stop right there. You wrote in your statement that she disappeared so you couldn't serve her. But she's lived in the same house for 14 years. You know where she lives. You could have served her any time you wanted. So that's not true, is it? Silence. And that's when I knew. That's when I absolutely knew this case was built on quicksand. That's not a good way to start off with me, I told her. Let me break down what actually happened here, because once you cut through all the drama and accusations, this case is pretty straightforward. Miss O'Brien ran a cleaning business. She had contracts to clean a charter school and a church. Miss Mackenzie worked for her as an employee. When Miss O'Brien went out of town, Miss Mackenzie would step in and do the cleaning jobs. Simple arrangement. She got paid $12 an hour in cash, and she'd done this 10 or 15 times over the summer of 2013. Now here's the key detail. Miss O'Brien kept all her cleaning supplies, vacuum, mops, all the equipment in her PT Cruiser. So instead of having Miss Mackenzie transfer everything to her own car, Miss O'Brien would tell her, just take my car, leave yours here and use mine. This wasn't unusual. This was their routine. Miss Mackenzie had used the PT Cruiser multiple times before with Miss O'Brien's full permission. Everyone agreed on that point. So in September 2013, Miss O'Brien and her husband went out of town for a few days, September 13th through the 17th. Miss Mackenzie was going to cover the cleaning jobs while they were gone. And just like always, she took the PT Cruiser. The keys were already in the car. That's how Miss O'Brien did things. She left the keys in the ignition for her employees to use. Again, this was standard procedure. Nothing unusual about it. While Miss Mackenzie had the car, something happened. She was driving from one location to another, using her GPS to navigate, when she hit something, a pothole, a rock. She wasn't entirely sure, but whatever it was, it put a hole in the radiator. Now this wasn't some massive crash. There was no collision with another vehicle, no property damage, just a hole in the radiator from hitting something in the road. Miss Mackenzie didn't panic. She and her son pushed the car to a nearby truck stop and she had the radiator patched. They welded the hole, added some stop leak fluid, and the repair cost $25. She paid for it herself and kept the receipt. After the repair, she drove the car back home with no issues, no overheating, no smoke, no warning lights. The car seemed fine. When Miss O'Brien came home and got her car back, she didn't immediately notice anything wrong. In fact, and this is crucial, she and her husband took the PT Cruiser and drove it themselves. First, they drove 1.4 miles to the charter school to clean it. Halfway there, Miss O'Brien noticed the car was running rough. She texted Miss Mackenzie to let her know. Then they finished the cleaning job and drove 2 more miles to the grocery store. At the grocery store, the car stalled out. Miss O'Brien texted Miss Mackenzie again. "We need to get this car to a shop." She managed to get it home. But when they pulled into the driveway, it stalled again. Her son had to help push it uphill, and that's when all the oil spilled out. Total miles Miss O'Brien drove the car after getting it back, 4.3 miles. But here's what Miss O'Brien claimed in her lawsuit. She said that when Miss Mackenzie returned the car, I was shocked. It had obviously been in an accident. Oil was pouring out of it and it was not drivable. Wait a minute. If oil was pouring out and it wasn't drivable, why did you drive it for 4 miles? Why did you stop at the school, do your cleaning job, then go grocery shopping? Why didn't you immediately take it to a mechanic if it was so obviously damaged? Because that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. Miss O'Brien also claimed in her statement that Miss Mackenzie wasn't supposed to drive the car because it didn't have insurance. But that didn't make any sense either. She'd given Miss Mackenzie permission to use the car multiple times before. She kept her work supplies in it specifically so her employees could use it. I looked at Miss O'Brien and I laid out the facts for her, clearly, simply, the way you explain things to someone who's trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Miss O'Brien, here's what I have, I said. Miss Mackenzie did not steal your car. She took your car with your permission to do your work. That was your arrangement. She was going to clean the school and the church while you were out of town. You gave her permission to use the car just like you'd done many times before. Miss O'Brien tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. She may have used the car for other things besides just going to work and back, I continued. That's possible, but that's not a lawsuit. That's not theft. And while she had the car, yes, she hit something and damaged the radiator. She acknowledges that, and she had it fixed. She paid for the repair herself. I held up the receipt, $25. You came home, you drove the car, you didn't see anything wrong with it at first. No visible damage, no evidence of a crash. The car wasn't vandalized. It wasn't destroyed. And you drove it first to a job, then to the grocery store. You didn't rush to a mechanic. You didn't treat it like an emergency. You just kept driving it. Miss O'Brien tried one more time. Your Honor, she told me she pulled off the side of the road and they just put some liquids in it. That's all she told me. Listen, I said, and my patience was wearing thin. I'm not buying your story, my dear. I started having trouble with you from the very beginning because of what you wrote in your statement. You said you couldn't find her for a year. That's not true. She's been in the same place. I established that 15 minutes ago. Miss O'Brien pulled out some papers. Your Honor, I have documents from firemen who own a store. They said she was living in a pizza place. Then serve her at the pizza place, I said. If you knew she was at a pizza place, serve her there. The problem is I don't believe you. That's the problem. What you wrote here was inaccurate. She didn't steal the car, but I have text messages. Goodbye, Miss O'Brien. Case dismissed. Miss Mackenzie won. No money owed. And you know why? Because the truth matters. Facts matter. You can't walk into a courtroom, make up a story about someone stealing your car and disappearing for a year, and expect me to just nod along. Miss Mackenzie had permission to use that car. She damaged the radiator. Yes. She got it repaired. Yes. She paid for that repair herself. And when Miss O'Brien got the car back, she drove it for 4 more miles before the problems got worse. If you damage your own property by continuing to drive a car that's running rough instead of taking it straight to a mechanic, that's on you. That's not someone else's fault. Here's what burns me up about cases like this. Miss O'Brien turned a minor incident, a $25 radiator repair, into a federal case. She accused her former friend of theft. She claimed this woman disappeared and went into hiding. She dragged her into court and tried to paint her as some kind of criminal. Why? Because they weren't friends anymore, because something soured their relationship. And Miss O'Brien decided to use the legal system to get revenge. That's not what courts are for. Courts are for justice, not revenge. They're for resolving legitimate disputes based on facts and evidence, not for airing your personal grudges. Miss Mackenzie sat in my courtroom looking exhausted because she'd been dealing with these false accusations for over a year. She'd been painted as a thief and a fugitive when all she'd done was work for someone, have a minor accident, pay for the repair, and return the car. The real damage here wasn't to the PT Cruiser. The real damage was to Miss Mackenzie's reputation. And that's the kind of damage that's hard to repair, no matter how much welding and stop leak fluid you use. I've been doing this job for a long time. I've heard every story, every excuse, every creative interpretation of the truth you can imagine. And I can tell you this, the truth always comes out, always. You might think you can hide it behind fancy words or complicated explanations, but the facts have a way of shining through. Miss O'Brien learned that lesson the hard way. She walked into my courtroom thinking she could control the narrative, thinking she could make herself the victim and Miss Mackenzie the villain. But all it took was a few simple questions. Where do you live? How long have you lived there? To unravel the whole thing. That's the beauty of the truth. It's simple. It's consistent. It doesn't need elaborate explanations or supporting documents from firemen who own stores. It just is. Miss Mackenzie went home that day vindicated. No judgment against her. No money owed. Her name cleared. And hopefully she learned something too. Be careful who you work for, and be even more careful who you call a friend. As for Miss O'Brien, well, she left my courtroom the same way a lot of people leave my courtroom when they've wasted everyone's time empty-handed, and I hope a little wiser. Because in my courtroom, the truth isn't just important, it's everything. And that's the way it should be.